Welcome back to the third and final key concept in Topic 4, the politics of education. In this short presentation, we'll unpack the concept transformation and consider how or if it contributes to our understandings of the politics of education. Again, I've distilled this presentation from what is quite a complex reading in Chapter 3. So if you're kind of wondering what this all means, then I'm hoping by the end of watching this video you'll be able to take away the key messages. Recapping our last topic, 4.2, we established the understanding that education can be understood as a process of reproduction of knowledge, skills and values of people and societies at particular times. In this video, we extend our thinking to consider the process of transformation. This process transpires alongside and is mutually constituted by the process of reproduction. For example, as I reproduce the practice of cooking a casserole, I might follow the text of reproduction, a recipe, but I might also transform the process by adding a few new ingredients or leaving some out. This would be what would be considered a minor or incidental transformation of practice. Educational transformations are, according to chemist Edwards Groves, practices and processes that stimulate changes to existing understandings, skills and values toward new understanding, skills and values. Often this occurs because the existing arrangements no longer accommodate or reflect the lived experience of particular people in particular places at particular points of time. Now that particularity is really important to grasp there. So the types of transformations that you're likely to make as a teacher to things like curriculum syllabus documents are going to be made with that lens of, well, that doesn't work here. These kids aren't going to understand that or grasp that. I'll use this example instead. So let's look at the example on in your text. Table 3.1 on page 89 of your text identifies a set of conditions that contribute to the reproduction of intergenerational disadvantage for some Indigenous Australians. The evidence supporting this list was reported in a study conducted by chemists in 2004, and a decade and a half on, these conditions continue to be reported in the annual Closing the Gap reports, so they're still quite valid. Of particular interest in this conversation are the conditions for children noted in the table that relate to their education, in this case, schooling. Now you've got a copy of this, but you can also stop and look at what these conditions are for children. So not all children, not all Indigenous children, some Indigenous children, and it was the children who were involved in this study in 2004. But as I said, if you read the annual Closing the Gap reports, these are still quite valid, I think, in some communities. So those conditions would be what we would probably call untoward conditions within particular communities for children's educational experiences. Table 3.2 provides an overview of some of the consequences of disadvantage for society and individuals. It's not an exhaustive list. The conditions or arrangements noted in the table focus our attention on the lived experience of some Indigenous Australians and most likely activates our own sense of social justice. Some questions, contestations and debates about these conditions and consequences lead us to consider the practical and critical interests of education. If so, these conditions are likely to lead educators to contemplate and question the question, how might or how can these conditions be transformed in order to improve the quality of life for individuals and for the communities that they live in? So living well in a world worth living in. What can we do if we were working in these communities or even at large to transform some of these arrangements or conditions. It's possible that some are quite easily transformed with interventions or actions from educators. It's also quite possible that others are quite large and not able to be done quite so easily. So table 3.3 assists our thinking about this question. It provides some examples of actions that could be considered and enacted in communities where these conditions prevail. The table also highlights the role the dominant society plays in perpetuating disadvantage and the conditions that sustain them. And this is definitely a political debate. We'll talk a bit more about this in your tutorials. So transformation here would involve changing some of these conditions within these communities. Leaving this example to one side now, the authors suggest that changing practices, such as the reproduction of untoward outcomes, can only be achieved when the arrangements or conditions holding them in place are transformed. Under these changed conditions, new practices, reproductions, are made possible. As education always occurs in a social and political context, the self-interests of particular groups, e.g. employers, can influence the inclusion or exclusion of particular content in curriculum policies. And evidences that the capacity of transformation lies beyond the life world of the school and for those engaging in the practices unfolding there. So it leads us back to think about the aims, the three aims of education. If we're simply looking at the technical interests and aims, then we're likely to not be quite so bothered by the untoward conditions for some people. If we're starting to look at the practical interests and aims, then we're going to be more concerned about the proper thing to do. And if we're going to activate the critical interests and aims of education, then we're going to critique the status quo of those conditions and probably take some action to contest or make movements toward transforming them. Although there's quite a bit written in your text about the notions of contestation and resistance, agency, for now it's enough for you to know that these forms of actions are most likely to be activated when individuals and societies extend their gaze from the technical interests to consider the practical and critical aims of their endeavours. So there's, as I said, quite a lot in the chapter, but transformation just means changing, looking at the conditions that prevail, that hold practices in place, and applying those practical and critical lenses to see if they need to be tweaked or changed dramatically within particular contexts. So that brings us to the end of topic 4, and in the next topic we'll be unpacking and thinking about the ways theories of education shape our understandings of what it means to be an educator in the 21st century.